he has weaned him? Only let the Lord establish his word. Then the woman stayed and nursed her son until he was weaned from him. Now, when she had weaned him, she took him up with her in 3 bowls, 1 ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young. There they slaughtered a bull and brought the child to Eli. And she said, O Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood by you here, praying to you, the Lord. For this child I have prayed, and the Lord has granted me petition which I asked of him. Therefore I have also lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he should be lent to the Lord. So they worship the Lord there. Please be seated.
Good morning and happy Mother's Day to everyone out there. I can look out amongst you and see my mom. I know right where she sat with my father for all those many years. I can see Ann sitting right over there where Kevin is. She sat with our kids. I can see many of the other mothers out here as well that have gone on to their reward. It truly is a special day as we celebrate Mother's Day. I mean, after all, I think being a mom and raising a child is not only the most important, but probably one of the most difficult jobs that anyone could have. And as I think back upon my life, and maybe you do as well this day, I remember the stories that Mom used to tell, the scriptures she used to read, the verses she forced us to memorize, the homework she helped me with. I never did get geometry. I mentioned to Mike Bryant, geometry is not math to me. I could never figure it out. And the relationship issues, problems that my mom helped me resolve. And I think that perhaps Napoleon was right when he said that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. Mothers. One of my very favorite stories in the Bible is from the life of Hannah. And just the name brings back the scope of what we see in verses 1 through 28 in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And that's where we're going to be camping this morning. We'll just stay focused right here. I love the name Hannah. As a matter of fact, if Drew had not been born a he and been born a she, instead of Andrew, I would have Hannah as a daughter. That was my name that I was able to select. But Drew ended that when he was born, so he's now Drew. The passage that we've read and we're going to be looking at in 1 Samuel, it really talks about a time in the nation of Israel when things were going well. As a matter of fact, the ages of the judges were coming to an end. In fact, in the last book of Judges, this is what we read, that everyone was doing what they saw was right in their own eyes. In other words, there was just no leadership. Now, Eli was a priest. He was a good priest. He was a godly man, but he was not a good leader. And that's what the nation of Israel needed. So we see there was a certain man from the hill country of Ephraim. His name was Elkanah. He had 2 wives. Peninnah was his first wife. Hannah was his second wife, not necessarily in that order. Now, Peninnah gave Elkanah kids, sons. But Hannah couldn't because she was barren. Now we here have a godly man that had two wives, and I want you to remember that in the Old Testament, polygamy was tolerated by God. That was never his plan, but it was tolerated by God. And every time we see a man with more than one wife, we see demonstrated the heartbreak that goes along with it, because that was never God's plan. God's plan has always been and always will be one man and one woman. So within this relationship between Elkanah and his two wives, we see heartbreak. We see dissension. We see all kinds of issues. And it all begins with this. Hannah had a burden. And Hannah's burden was that she was barren. Now, Hannah's name meant grace or favor. And the thing that caused her suffering was she couldn't have kids. She was barren. And in the culture of that time, a woman was good for only one thing, and one thing only. And that was to produce children, particularly sons, for her husband. And Hannah couldn't. So there must have been something wrong with her according to the culture. It must be that she had sinned. She had done something wrong to offend God so that he would not allow her to have children. And so her personal worth was diminished. She felt beneath everyone else because she could not have children. How do you think that she felt personally? What about her self-esteem? You know, to add to her problems, Peninnah, Elkanah's other wife, continued to have children, and every time they went up to the temple to sacrifice, she continued to provoke Hannah, to make fun of her, to irritate her. This wasn't a very happy home, was it? But yet it was a godly home. Every year, when Elkanah went up with his family to where the tabernacle was and offered sacrifices to the Lord, he gave a portion of the sacrifices to members of his family. And the custom was that the oldest son would get a double portion of the sacrifice. But in this case, Elkanah gave a double portion of the sacrifice, not to his oldest son, but to Hannah. Because he wanted her to understand, and he wanted everyone around, including Peninnah, to understand how much he loved Hannah and how important she was to him. And as much as he loved her, he couldn't understand her grief because she couldn't have children. In fact, if you look at 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 8, this is what it says. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Now, you might think that that's pretty arrogant. But the problem is he didn't understand what she was going through. As we talked about in class, we are all men and women created in the image of God. But God created men and women differently. We don't always think the same. We don't always reason the same. We don't always understand the same. How many times have your wife said to you, you know, you just don't understand what I'm going through? Well, sometimes we don't, because we're not wired the same. I remember conversations Ann and I would have, and she would tell me about her day in great detail, in great description. And I would say to her, honey, this is all very interesting, but can't you give me the Reader's Digest version? But you see, that's not the way she thought, because every detail, when she would go to school with the kids and talk to so-and-so and what they would say and on and on and on, it was important to her. And I say all of that to say, this points out to say how it's important for us, for our wives, for women, and for men, husbands, to have godly friends of the same gender. So that when godly women are going through things that only women understand, they have someone to talk to that can relate and help them get through whatever it is they're going through. The husband and wife relationship is paramount. But sometimes we just don't understand. Elkanah did not understand why she was so downcast and so disheartened because she couldn't have children. He already had kids. That was good enough for him, but not for her. So, who was responsible for her barrenness, her condition, her downcast, her diminished vision of herself? It was God. It was God and no one else, because we see in verses 5 and verse 6 of 1 Samuel chapter 1 that God had closed her womb. She was barren because of God, because he had a plan for her life that wasn't yet time to come about. So in the meantime, he closed her womb. God planned her suffering. And that's hard for us to think of God doing that. But again, it was all part and parcel of what he was about to do to her and for her. I think when we look back upon our lives too, we see times in our lives when we didn't seem to have control over what was going on in our life. As long as we have control, as long as we can solve our problems, as long as we can get through by ourselves whatever we're going through, then we don't know the power of God. And sometimes God will take a situation in our life where we are absolutely powerless to resolve. And what do we do when that happens? It's then that we turn to God. And it's then that we truly understand his love for us and the power that he has in our life. Sometimes it takes what she was going through for her to really understand the power of God. It's no different for us as well. So when everything else was falling apart and when she was at the absolute end of her rope, who was there? It was God. So what did she do? Hannah prayed. Let's read together verses 9 through 18. 1 Samuel chapter 1. Again, beginning of verse 9. Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used to cut his head. As she kept praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer distraught. Think about that. Hannah had come to a decision. I just can't live like this any longer. And when she was at the end of her rope, when she was at the very bottom of the pit, she turned to God. She took her bitterness before the Lord. The Bible tells us that she was in deep anguish as she prayed. You ever prayed in deep anguish before? You ever felt in your life that it's just not fair? Have you ever prayed to God and said, God, what I'm going through is not fair. Where are you? And sometimes we are afraid to be honest with God, to go to him in prayer and let him know how we're really feeling. Her prayer was not simply, God, would you please take care of Elkanah and everything around us? No. From the very bottom of her soul, she prayed to God in deep anguish. She let him know exactly how she was feeling. And it's important for us to do the same. When we go to God in prayer, we need to be honest when we're praying. For two reasons. Reason number one, God already knows, doesn't he, what's in your heart. God already knows how you're feeling. So why not just be honest with him and tell him how you feel? And if you're angry with him, if you're angry with circumstances, whatever it happens to be, it's not a lack of faith. If it was lack of faith, you wouldn't be praying to him. But the second thing it does, when you pray openly and honestly with God, it relieves you of a burden. She poured out her heart to God. And what does it say? Then she went away and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast because she'd given it all to him. You read in the Psalms, you find David many times saying all kinds of things. And he will start out by saying, I'm surrounded by my enemies, and all these terrible things are happening to me. And Lord, where are you? But the psalm always ends when he's saying, in faith, God, I know you're going to take care of it. I know you're going to take care of it. So in her prayer, Hannah made a vow to the Lord about her son. If I were blessed with a son, he would serve you the rest of his life. And when she finished her prayer, Eli the priest blessed her. It's interesting to see. It was her faith at the end of the prayer that gave her joy, because she knew that God would answer that prayer. Do you remember those three Jewish boys that were standing at the edge of a furnace with King Nebuchadnezzar there? And Nebuchadnezzar said, if you don't bow down and worship my idol, then I'm going to throw you into the furnace to burn. What God could possibly save you from me? And you remember what the three boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, said? Our God can save us. But if not, Remember those three words. But if not, we will never bow down to your idol. I think those are three important words for us as well when we pray. When we ask God to help us with something or to give us something, or in some way either accommodate our needs or our wants, to include in our hearts as we say that, but if not, I will always trust you. I will always have faith in you. I always know that you answer my prayers in a way that's best for me. But if not, the outcome may be different than I expected, but I will know it was what's best for me and my family. That was Hannah's prayer. Then we see Hannah's son. Look at verses 18 and 19. 19 and 20. Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, what does that mean? When the time was right, in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. She hadn't had a child yet, but she said that when she did, she would dedicate her son to the Lord. He would be a Nazirite. So 3 things a Nazirite couldn't do. Number 1, they never shaved their head. So never cut their hair. Number 2, they'd never touch anything dead. And number 3, they would never drink from the fruit of the vine. Drink no wine. So she made the vow that he would be dedicated to God. I'm going to give this child back to you. She wanted the son, of course, to carry on the family name. But more importantly, to carry on a relationship with God and to serve the Lord his entire life. So she named her son Samuel, which translated is God has heard. God has heard. The interesting thing about this, too, is that God allowed women of that day to have access to him. You remember how men felt about women back in those days? There were no such thing as equal rights. But yet, to God, there was. He loved them all the same. So he allowed women of that day to have direct access with him. She didn't go to Eli and ask Eli to offer a prayer as a priest to God for her. She went directly to him because God allowed that. And we see Hannah's vow being fulfilled, the passage that Bob read. Over and over again, the Bible tells us the importance of keeping a vow, a promise that we made to the Lord. Simply let your yes be yes. And she did that. She kept her vow. Now, look over to 1 Samuel chapter 2, beginning of verse 1. Did Hannah cry when she left her young son with Eli, never to have him home with her again? How did she feel about that? Then Hannah prayed and said, my heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one beside you. There is no rock like our God. There is no rock like our God. The God of Hannah is the God of us. There's only one. And we have no rock in our life like the God, like the Lord. So how many children did Hannah ask for? How many children did she ask for? She asked for one. How many did God give her? He gave her 6. You can never outdo God. She asked for one. She got 6. Every year when she went up to offer sacrifice, she saw her son, Samuel. Never took him back home. You know, Israel was in trouble. Again, it was the time of the judges, and at the end of Judges, everyone we see was doing what was right in their own eyes. They were breaking the Mosaic covenant. But God needed a righteous man to turn things around. Hannah gave Israel a son that turned the nation around. But before that man could be born, before that son could be born, before that child could be born, God selected a woman to be the mother of that child, to turn a sinful nation to righteousness. There was another mother that we read about in the Bible that God selected specifically for a reason, wasn't there? Her name was Mary. But sometimes we forget Hannah was selected specifically for this reason as well. What did Samuel do? It was Samuel that brought them back to righteousness. It was Samuel that anointed the first king. It was Samuel that anointed the second king. And it was Samuel who became the last judge and the very first prophet of the nation of Israel. Israel needed a man, and God gave them one. But first, he gave that boy a mother that would raise him up so that he would be committed to the Lord. God needs mothers like that today. And God needs children like that as well. Mothers, I don't want to get emotional. But when we think about our life, and we think about who we are today, how much of who you are is a direct result of your mother, who never stopped believing in you, who never stopped praying for you, who never stopped loving you. God's gift to mankind is a mother. If we can help you this morning in any way, we want to do that. If you need prayers of the congregation or you've not yet become a child of God,